afternoon and welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. Before we would begin, I would just like to thank you for being here and for tuning in on our live stream. We're thrilled to celebrate with you today. If you're here and would like to buy books supporting the authors who have chosen to be part of our panel, we'll be selling those at the back counter following the discussion. And we also welcome you to check out the collections that Warren will be discussing today, which I'm about to describe in a little more detail. I'd love to start by introducing the bookseller who has spearheaded these sections and who is our moderator today. Lauren James joined the Booksmith this past fall, shortly after moving to Brookline. While she was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, her people are from Jamaica and Guyana. She currently takes care of our sections on gender and sexuality studies, as well as Asian, Latina, Indigenous, and Black studies. She's been curating our new sections for the culture and best of Black literature, which again, you should check out because there are some incredible books in there. While Black studies informs an anti-racist perspective by offering education on anti-Black racism in its various forms, these two new sections provide a more holistic and affirming view of Black people and their contributions to society. Before joining the team, Lauren worked as a middle school math teacher who aspired to teach math for social justice. In her free time, she writes music, tutors math, and can hardly wait to build another guitar. Now, I'm thrilled to hand this over to Lauren, who's going to introduce our authors and get this party started.
Thank you so much, Alex. We're welcome to the... Can you hear me okay?
I can. I just didn't know if it was really...
Does the sound travel all right?
Yeah.
Better. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. We're delighted to welcome you, our authors, and our guests here today. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us and choosing us to be your local independent bookstore. When you shop with us and visit with us, your support helps us to keep going strong. So thank you once again for being here. We really appreciate it. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of the discussion. So please hold your questions in your head, but do get them ready. We'll be passing around a mic during the question and answer session so that all the other members are able to hear your questions. Please be sure to put your phones on silent and during the duration of this conversation, and thank you all for wearing your mask at this event. So we'll get started with the introduction. Lisa Stringfellow is the author of A Como Bushes, a middle grade... Can you still hear me all right? Yeah. Does it sound better? I'll pause a moment for the mic check. I think it's better now. Awesome. Thanks, team. Sorry about that. Lisa Stringfellow is the author of A Como Bushes, a middle grade novel about mermaids, monsters, and black gold magic. She wrote her debut novel while working as a middle school teacher of language arts and technology. Lisa has held webinars for writers to help them develop an online presence by offering advice on how to build and maintain a website and social media pages. She also started a little free Kidlit library that supports Black, Indigenous, people of color authors by featuring their books. She has recently learned to play the piano and has two cats, Leia and Tabitha. Lisa, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much.
Quintin Collins is the author of two full collections of poetry, A Dandelion Speaks of Survival and Claim Tickets for Stolen People, which won the Journal's 2020 Charles B. Wheeler Poetry Prize. His poetry has also appeared in many publications, both in print and online, and has earned many other awards and accolades, including a Pushcart Prize. He's currently a writer, editor, and assistant director of the Solstice Low Residency Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing Program. Before this role, he worked in digital marketing field as a writer, section editor, and managing editor. Quintin, thank you for being with us as well.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me when I turn to speak with our authors as well?
Okay, cool.
Please join me in giving Lisa and Quintin a warm welcome. As we transition into the discussion portion of the event, I'd like to pause to have a quiet moment so we can allow us to hold space and time to reflect on our reasons for coming together today, to honor the spirit of Juneteenth, and to bring our attention into our shared space. So we'll just take a brief moment to take a moment of reflection. The National Museum of African American History and Culture explains the history of this holiday, which was the first federal holiday to be created since Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That history is that on June 19, in 1865, the General Gordon Granger with the Union Army arrived in Galveston, Texas, informing the enslaved African Americans of their freedom and the Civil War had ended, and he enforced the end of slavery in the rebelling states. With the backing of the Union Army. This momentous occasion has been celebrated as Juneteenth, which is a combination of June and 19, in honor of June 19, 1865, and has been celebrated for over 150 years. Lisa and Quintin, I wanted to open this conversation with pausing for a moment to ask you, what does Juneteenth really teach you?
I can start. I didn't grow up with the tradition of Juneteenth. I know originating in Texas, it really was a regional event in a lot of places until it started to spread other places. But I think just the importance of like that celebration of emancipation, thinking about what our ancestors had to survive to still be here and for us to thrive. I think the meaning to me is about thinking about the resiliency of like Black people, as well as thinking about how we still manage to be creative and find joy and uplift each other throughout all of that long history. So yeah, it's really about like just support and family and celebration of those things.
Yeah, I think that the nature of my knowledge of Juneteenth was very sparse up until very recently. And it's interesting, a lot of, conversation around when this became a holiday was we had a lot of Black folk who were just like, oh, hey, like, I never knew Juneteenth was a thing. And so my understanding was very general to the idea of what my American education told me, was that this was the day the slaves became aware they were free. No idea of location, the fact that this had anything specifically to do with Texas, that was just all we were given at the time. And I think that, once that conversation started happening, what I really took as being the most important aspects of, the holiday is, making it a holiday is kind of, gives me mixed feelings, right? Because I don't even really see it as a consolation prize in terms of like, the actual impact of what we ask for. But I do appreciate any opportunity where we are taking space, right? Not just being given space, but taking space to really show out as Black people and rejoice. And I think that that's what's really kind of been the upside for me, right? Is that we've taken something that is a very meager, a very meek offering of, what we should be getting, and we're embracing it to the fullest that we can to celebrate and to rejoice within it. And I think that, that's anytime we have an opportunity to do that, it's important and it's powerful on its own.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that. In both of your written works, you refer to the legacy of slavery and the freedom of Black people. Lisa, in A Comb of Wishes, your main character, Kayla's ancestors were enslaved people. Can you speak to your choice to include this family history in your story?
Yeah, so A Comb of Wishes is set on a fictional Caribbean island, which is very much based on Barbados, which is where my father was from. And in deciding to craft the story set in the Caribbean, I realized that you really can't tell that story without including the story of enslavement, because it's such a huge part of, that and colonization, such a huge part of like where, how people got there and how like culture developed. The plantations, even Keela's mother is a historian who collects.
Can we get register 3, please? Register 3.
A lot of that just is connected. So I felt like even though the story is middle grade and even though the story is a
I'm on my
fantasy,
way.
it's really grounded in a real place and time that is affected by history, and that needed to be part of the story as well. So Keela, in the story, does some research and she, finds out about, the slave trade, and she's asking questions about like what are free people, and they're trying to make a connection to figure out this mystery that they're trying to solve. But I think it's something that middle schoolers need to hear and understand to develop kind of like that cultural competency to understand kind of like how things in the present are still connected to things in the past.
Definitely. And I was noticing how you definitely bring in this history into the story, but it's like there are references throughout the story, not the main plot of the story. Do you think that was the way you handled this topic to make it developmentally appropriate for middle schoolers?
I think so, but I think, you know, having taught fifth and sixth grade for a really long time, I think that they're really smart and they're really empathetic and like they can get tough things. But I think, you know, I think the thing that was important was to mention it because like to not mention it is like a form of erasure.
Right.
And so those things like need to be there, and I think there's a lot more books now coming out that have, you know, different topics that, you know, people might consider tough or serious, but I think that middle schoolers are capable of understanding and bringing out their critical thinking too. So I felt like it was appropriate to add that.
And why was it important for you to bring that history to bear in Kayla's present reality, not just leaving it as a part of the past, but there was an intimate link with her current story? Why was that link of the past and the present important for you to meet?
Yeah. So for people who don't know much about the story yet, Keela, the main character, her mother has passed away right before the novel starts, and she's grieving for her. And kind of one of the first instances is that she finds this mysterious box that has a comb in it. She quickly realizes it's a mermaid's comb, and she gets offered the opportunity of a wish, and thinks she wants the most to bring her mother back from the dead. And the who the mermaid is and kind of like why she is the way she is, not kind of like a Little Mermaid typical like happy mermaid,
Right.
really does have to do with that history. You know, there's a lot of betrayal in her past from humans, and that betrayal really is linked to the slave trade. There's something that Keela discovers that ancestor of hers was connected to this mermaid, and the reason that the mermaid is so bitter has to do with something that was done to her related to like the slave trade. So like it really does connect her past and her present. And I think also the fact that I chose to have her mother be this collector of history and keeping all of these stories. I think that's so important for us today because there's so many stories that are starting to slip away, and if we don't like remember them, try to capture them, record them, they'll be lost. And so that's something that I wanted to touch on too.
And as we speak about the present day, Quintin, in your works, you depict in great detail the violence, the racialized violence that Black people endure still to the present day, even as we speak to the history of Juneteenth. Even in this present moment, there's a tension between being free and yet still being in danger while living in a Black body. Can you speak to those tensions that you bring up in your works?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about it, right, is it's in the fabric of this country, right? It's not like we're in a place where you can't go 50 feet and learn of some atrocity that's been committed against all kinds of marginalized people. And we're digging up more of it all the time and being more horrified all the time. And I think a big piece of that is how do we reckon with that from our different, vantage points. And so for me, as someone who's writing, it's hard not to consider that aspect of living in this place because it's literally everywhere, right? This third thing I'm working on has a lot to do with chronic illness, but like I can't talk about chronic illness without talking about being Black in America because these things all intersect together. And so when we sit and we think about like, okay, so what's the legacy of the history of this country and how does it come into everything we write? It's complicated to forego it, right? Because when you don't include it, again, as Lisa says, that's erasure, right? But in some cases, if we're not including it for a particular reason, like that means as much as it does to include it, right? The places that we are highlighting joy, the places that we are rejoicing in the mundane things that keep us happy and that we celebrate. That's why I like writing about summer. Like being Black in summer is an amazing experience, right? I like writing about it because like that's a space we own and we hold and it's ours.
Yeah.
so, when we do that, that means just as much as when we talk about these things, because again, it's embedded everywhere. I will never forget, being on one of the like trolley tours here, because my parents were in town. I'm just gonna take them around and let them see things, and like the manner in which they talk about the legacy of slavery here in Boston was like, let's just quickly mention this because this is a bullet point that we have to mention, but like now let's talk about all the great things on the Freedom Trail. I'm like, well, no, like that's a big piece of history for the foundations of the country. So why aren't we talking about that on this tour? Why aren't we talking about how that legacy is manifested in these locations we're looking at? As much as we're talking about, hey, look, you can still see the Old North Church. I'm like, that's cool, but it all bleeds through in how how I write and how we approach the work, because again, it's everywhere. It's unavoidable, and it's very obvious when you try to omit it for the sake of not talking about it. I mean, there's a whole contingent of work going on around omitting these things right now, and it's hard to miss.
Right. Speaking to the Freedom Trail that you were just speaking to kind of in Boston, one of your poems in Playing Tickets for Stolen People speaks from the perspective of the sea, and one of the lines was Out of America's History by Waves. Can you speak to why did you choose to speak from the perspective of the sea in that piece?
Well, I think a part of that, that idea of things being within the fabric is you start to, at certain points, realize how many aspects of your life and your existence are based in, the oppressed and colonized perspective that, kind of set this country, right? Like, so many different little things you can think about. You can like, oh, I think this way because that's the predominant culture, and it's all rooted in the same thing. So, how can we reimagine everything outside of that space? And so, thinking about like the connections with nature, right? Like, how do we leverage and how do we command, nature, or feel like we do? But what real power does it have, right? Like this idea that, as humankind and as capitalism, we have control over anything that's of the natural world is ridiculous, right? But that's kind of like one of those things that's ingrained in this whole perspective of ownership, what people in this country have ownership of. So in looking at, okay, well, what's a good symbol for the natural world, one that's localized, because this book, I did a lot of writing from the perspective of having lived in Boston for a few years at that point. And, the fact that, like, hey, like, this is not just a body of water. This is, for us, the body of water that brought us here forcibly. And how does the ocean talk back against that? The ocean didn't want it as much as we didn't want to be here. And so, when we, again, consider these things, it's this idea of, like, how can I give every single thing around me that is constrained to this perspective of voice to say something different? And in this case, I mean, it was from a long list of topics, and the ocean was one of them, because, again, it's the ocean for us. It is the ocean that has that, will always have that history and that meaning, and I can't look at it without thinking, like, hey, like, this is the first ocean I probably have seen in my life, and, like, this is what I have to contend with when looking at it.
Definitely. And Lisa, in your work, you also speak to the role that the sea plays in being a witness of the transatlantic slave trade, and you not only do you speak to the sea as a witness, but you also personify the sea. Can you speak to your choice to also give voice to like the personhood of the sea, and why you chose to have the sea be their witness?
Yeah, that what you're just said, Quintin, like resonates so much about like it being the body of water for people from the Black diaspora. That resonates a lot. I think in the story, Ophidia the mermaid is a child of the sea, and so I wanted to personify the sea as like the mother of all of these things that come from her, and so it talks to her, and so even as like she's like dealing with the trail, like she's been raised to feel like she knows certain things about humans, but like she also has a pull of like empathy when she meets one for the first time, that she feels like there could be friendship there, and the sea cautions her to say they will bring you pain, and she's like, she takes that chance anyway early on, and she comes to find out her mother was right. I felt like that just has a lot to say. There's a lot of mother-daughter relationships in the book between Keela and her mother, who it's not, I think, too much of a spoiler to say that that wish that she makes does come true, and so there's that relationship between them, and then there's also the relationship between Lydia and the sea. I just feel like it spoke to kind of like the bonds that are so important, but then also the sea's memories long, and so that connected to all of the storytelling that I wanted to bring in, because it had something to say to both Keela and Lydia, just even today.
Right. As you speak to the way that you personified the sea as a mother, I was really intrigued by the caretaking role you gave to the sea. Because I've been thinking that, like, as a teacher, you're also a caretaker during the school day for your students. What was it like when your students heard that you had written a book? I was just curious about that. A bit of a pivot, but
Yeah, no. So I actually wrote this book with my students. I wrote part of it in the classroom.
Wow.
So I've been teaching for a long time. I just finished my 28th year.
Congratulations.
So, one of the things we do in the classroom is NaNoWriMo, which stands for National Novel Writing Month, and there's a young writer's version of it. And so I do it with my students and say, okay, you're going to write a novel in 30 days, and you can choose your word count, because they get to do that when they're younger, unlike adults who have to do the adult 50,000 words. But I said, yeah, I'm going to do this with you. And so those students that were in my class when I first started it just graduated from high school.
Wow.
So it's like how long ago that this book took from start until when it was actually published. But they're excited, and just even the students that I had this year, it was so sweet because they are the ones that the book finally came out while I have them, whereas all the other kids over the years have just been hearing that, oh, she's working on this novel, or oh, she finally got a literary agent, or oh, she finally has, it's going to come out. But they'd ask me, like, when's it coming out again? I'm like, 2022. And I was like, oh my gosh, so far away. But it was very sweet. The book came out this year. The kids, would bring me their little copies and say, like, can you sign my book? And I'm like, can you wait after class? So I'll sign it for you. So very supportive, and I think hopefully a lot of them also felt like they could do this at some point because they saw me doing it. So.
I realizing that, like, you're working as a teacher while working on a novel at the same time, I was thinking of the connection between what we've been talking about, the legacy of what Black people survive and continue to survive in this country, and specifically your role as a teacher in a school right now. Can you speak to what it's been like as a teacher with all that's been going on in the news these days?
Tough. There's been, the last 3 years of teaching, 2 to 3 years, I think all teachers will say have been like the hardest of our career.
Right.
Between COVID and between 2020 with all the protests after George Floyd's murder, just like how do you talk to kids about that has been hard. How do you comfort kids this year? The end of the year with again the proliferation of gun violence. I had kids even in my end of the year conferences just a few weeks ago where parents were saying they're really having a hard time. Like they don't know that they're really going to be saved, and so there's just so much going on in the minds of kids that teachers are just working to reassure them, but then also bring truth. And I think another thing that I talked about a lot this year with my students is book banning that's been happening in many schools. Fortunately, in my school, it's not an issue that kids are free to read what they want to read, and we try to introduce books that are speaking to the experiences of all different people and families. But I bring it up to them to say, hey, look, you guys are so lucky that you have this freedom, and there are a lot of other students who don't have that, and so. And they just look at me incredulous when I bring up stories about this book was taken out of the classroom with disability, and if people protested at a school board meeting. And so I think it's just that balance of reassuring them, giving them, I talk a lot about windows and mirrors in my classroom, which is Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's metaphor for books that kids can see themselves in reflected, as well as books that they can look through and gain empathy about other people and their perspectives. So there's that, as well as them to understand, the privileges that they have being in a place where things are information is so open to them, and how they can talk to their families and talk to other people about how important that right to read is. So, and then also making sure they feel safe. So,
Right.
a lot of things going on that we try to work on.
Definitely. And this is a question for both of you. With all that's going on these days, how do you balance being an informed citizen while protecting your mental health? Because you were mentioning that your students are having a hard time sometimes. As you model for your students, and a question for both of you, how do you find that balance between being informed and protecting mental health, and what role does your writing have to play in that process?
I think a big part of that sometimes is you want to be informed, but you have to turn the news off. It's not, what happened in the past week is not going anywhere, and there's not a way for you to find out when you're in the right headspace for it. And I think a lot of the work that goes into, the writing itself is sometimes the prompt for the day is to write a happy poem. And I think the importance of that is, when I think about the nature of what Juneteenth meant in that moment, right? Juneteenth was an instance of imagining a world beyond what these people need. And not only was it imagination, it was real. How dangerous is that to people you were trying to oppress when they can imagine a world beyond what they were currently in? That's why they were not allowed to read. That's why they were not allowed to write. Because in any instance where people can imagine, this is why I love speculative stuff so much, and the idea of Afrofuturism, right? When you're allowed to imagine a world that is not your current situation, that becomes dangerous because you start to strive for it. And so, there's a world in which we have to imagine not living in the misery all the time, because if we only see the misery, we don't really get a sense of remembering what we're fighting to be, better. What does better look like? And sometimes it's just today is the day I get to turn off the news, I get to step back, and I get to let somebody else do the work, because I need to make sure that I am ready for it, and that I remember what it is I'm striving to create change toward. And I have friends who, from time to time, they said what? I have a lot of thoughts about these things, but my Instagram, for instance, is my social media channel that I will not post about these things in. My Instagram is for only positive things, because this is my space where on the internet I can be safer in addressing the world. And one of the other amazing small things that I learned from a friend to do is even when I'm having thoughts or feelings about how things are going, or others are, when you're commiserating with people who feel the same, ask me hey, what's your headspace like right now for me to talk to you about this before I even launch in? Hey, what's your headspace for me rejoicing right now about something because of everything that's going on? Because that little bit of care that we can take with each other kind of helps establish those boundaries that we all might have for all right, there's a lot going on right now, but am I ready to deal with this and do the work that needs to be done? Are others ready? And how can we all be on the same page about that readiness? And yeah, when it comes to the writing space, you have to decide. Today is the day that I'm not going to write into that space. And for people who write longer prose, it might be this is the day I'm just not going to write that section. This is the day that I'm going to write the sections that are great, and happy for me. And then other days are the days when I'm ready. I'm going to dig into it. Or maybe this is just not the book. There's a lot of books that are coming out now where, the idea being, we are not going to write a book or a movie that is purely about black pain. It's going to be nothing but black joy. That intentional choice again, right? Because, we're trying to establish some spaces where people can go to and say, today is the day that I want to focus on it from the side of rejoicing and happiness and joy. And then when I'm ready to dig into that work again, when I'm ready to hit the streets, when the next protest is there, I am up for it. I have the energy, I have the space, because you take that time for yourself.
So much, again, what you just said, like, resonates with me. I think the big thing for me is turning things off. You know, sometimes when I get a little blip on my watch or something that there's something that's going on, I just refuse to watch the news that night because I know I'll hear about it the next day, and just rather than you get sucked in and then it really does like drain all of your emotion, that energy. It takes energy to think about those things, and then you're like worrying, and it's not productive. So sometimes I'll just wait and get the information when I need it. It is hard sometimes, I find, to separate, you know, all of those, like you have to compartmentalize a little bit. But I think that what you said about like I write speculative fiction, it's like imagining those worlds that like you wish they could be. And I think too, so far all of the stories that I've been working on, you know, I really am eager to show those stories of like community and support. So like, even though Keela's had bad things happen to her and her family, the community around her is not dysfunctional. They're really solid and supportive, and they love her, and she's got some people that really care and are watching out for her. That's something that's important. I think that doesn't get picked up enough on in just different kinds of media, that there's people focus on like the brokenness or the dysfunction of different parts of the community. And I think that's kind of my way of showing, you know, no, like our community is loving and supportive, and you know, there for each other. But as far as like separating kind of like what happens in our daily lives and like how that affects you creatively, I think it takes work. You have to be intentional about it. I don't always get it done the way I want to, but just trying to like save time for yourself and remembering that self-care is like the most important thing you can do.
Definitely. Speaking of self-care, you speak to, like, you're both speaking to the, let me take a moment to get out of this question. I wanted to understand the role of your writing process in your self-care, right? Is there writing that you do that's just for you? And if so, is that writing different from your professional writing?
I'd say I mean, this is the joy of being a poet, right? It's very easy for me to write something that's done and be done and say, okay, I don't care what happens to this. This is a thing that I wrote to practice. You know, it doesn't have to be part of anything bigger. I don't have to think about anything outside of the contained space of the poem. And so that makes it very easy to sit down and say, like, okay, this is a poem for me. But at the outset, though, I know, like, there's these ideas about, like, who you're writing the poem for. So many books that talk about the relationship of the poet to the world and to nature and to God, and, you know, like, who's speaking through the poet and all this. And I think that some of that is just like, I'm going to write the poem, right? I'm a person in the world. There are people who are also in the world, and there's going to be at least one person who's going to be like, all right, this is me in this poem. That's all I have to think about. If I spend too much time trying to write for other people and saying, like, okay, this is the day to write for other people, then I'm kind of losing, you know, the importance of the impetus of, you know, what I'm doing in the first place. Because yes, like, I ultimately do want people to pick this book up and say, like, hey, just help me, you know, like, even if it just like help me chuckle a little bit, help me, right?
Yeah.
But I
Can we
have
go
to
to
make sure
register
that,
3,
like,
please? Register 3.
I'm writing this thing that's supposed to be the thing I want to write, because there are so many places where, I mean, I don't know how many people here know this, but like, there was a student, you know, at a school here locally who was berated by an adult for writing about their experience as a black individual in West Roxbury, right? And then not only did the student have to deal with the backlash that came from this, but now while people are trying to help, you know, like, what do you want to do when you have that much attention? You just want less, regardless, right? And so now, like, what does that kid feel like they can and can't do when they write? You know, even if they feel vindicated in their opinion about things because
Yeah, Rage 4 as well.
of the
Rage 4
outcome,
as well.
like, now they feel like they can't write something anymore, which was their experience and is a very valid experience living in the Boston area as a person of color, right? So you have to sit down and say, I'm gonna write this thing that's for me and that's mine, And it doesn't have to go anywhere. It can sit in a drawer forever. It can sit in your Google Drive forever, and it never may see the world. But like, you have to do it some days. And if there are things that are, maybe actually not for you, but you think they're for you, and you're writing something that you shouldn't be, somebody's gonna tell you. And maybe you should ask yourself a little bit first, and sit with it for a little bit. And those are things that can stay in the drawer of the Google Drive too. But ultimately, write what you need to write.
I think there's a lot to be said about just like writing for the action and practice of writing, and not everything is really meant to be read by other people or like eventually try to be published. And sometimes just you need to go through that work in order to learn how to be a writer. I think I am a person that I like to be really practical, and so when I'm writing, I tend to be writing for something like on like whatever manuscripts I'm doing rather than doing exercises. But I find that because I don't have that discipline to like do the extra thing for practice, that's why I love to take craft classes. And so Quintin knows me through like solstice classes. Sometimes I'll take, because like they'll push classes, sometimes push you, and workshops will push you to do things that you maybe wouldn't have tried. And then there's again that process of learning how to express yourself in different ways, and it might just be something that stays in a drawer, but like you've learned something that you can apply to other writing later. So yeah, I definitely agree that not everything is like meant to be, like you don't need that pressure on yourself. I mean, everything's not meant to be seen necessarily.
Definitely. And speaking of the role of writing in resilience and in self-care, both of you in your stories, both of you lead the power of the stories we tell ourselves. Lisa, in your novel, you elevate the myths of a culture by making them true stories in your story. As Keela comes to find out that the myths of our people are true, I was wondering, why did you make the choice to make those myths a reality?
I think because like there's a certain amount of like validation that she needed at that point in the story, because she's wondering, she has this experience with this mermaid, she doesn't think anybody is gonna believe her, and so when she comes to this like trusted family friend, and she tells her own best friend who believes her, like there's that validation of like, I'm telling you something that I think that's happening, and that person's saying, I support you and I'm gonna help you. And like we all need those kind of people in our lives. And I think the same with the adults, when she comes to this trusted family friend who's an adult, and they listen, and then they say, you know what, you're right, and here's what I know. I think again, because so much of like her experience to this point was dealing with her grief instead of hiding it and not telling people how much she was struggling, to have her be able to tell what was going on and people believe her and say like, yes, there's this history. I think also it just connects like the world of magic and fantasy with like reality. I think that's one of the things that people, as a teacher sometimes I'll have parents say like, oh, like my child, all they read is fantasy, how can I get them to read something else? And can you make any recommendations? And I of course can. I always ask the child like, what is it you like? But I always try to talk to parents about the fact that there's a role in fantasy, and like there's so much that like is metaphor and like involves like thinking about like the world around us and like what is beyond that, and like what things could be in the future, possibilities that I think are really possible and important. And so I definitely just wanted to connect again, like we talked about the past and the present, with like the real and the things that we sometimes think maybe aren't like or imagine that really do have some basis in truth.
I think, just to respond to that, I think that idea of being believed, right? That's like one of our biggest issues right now, is we're still trying to convince people, not that certain issues are worth addressing, but that they exist in the first place, right? Like some people think microaggressions like are non-existent, right? And I'm just like, no, they've been existent for a while. It's just that we're starting to talk about the fact that you have been saying things for years that were not okay, and we're finally telling you they're not okay, right? That's a big piece, that we talk about the reality of the truth, and the fact that we not only have that, but we exist in a space where truth is being disputed. Not even opinions about things, but truth that you can say is, are there 5 grapes or are there not? You know, like, well, you know, like the media says there's 5 grapes. Like, it's kind of crazy that like that's where we're at. But you know, it's not so much that there's a phenomenon of like truth is being eroded because you know it's just happening. It's a concerted effort. It's a campaign to do this. And so like this idea of you know being believed when you say things, when you put them in, and when you talk about you know again like reality that is reality, and reality that also seems outlandish but is reality. You know that's something that's big, and that's like you know you put that into the writing. You know when you read like that's one of the reasons I love nonfiction. You read those nonfiction books where it's like I can't believe a person really went through this, right? And when like for me, I have like the privilege of you know knowing some of those people, and it's like, wait, you like this was your life, right? Like I'm sitting here with you now having a conversation, but like this is, you know, what brought you to the moment we're in right now is cinematic as it may seem is the word I'll use for it. You know, that idea of belief is what helped that book get into other people's hands, right? It's what's helping that proliferate. And so like what happens if someone tries to ban that book? You know, what happens if someone tries to ban that reality because it doesn't fit a narrative that they want to establish for, you know, hiding the things of this country? You know, all those things are, again, powerful in how we speak back against that, how we keep books in kids' hands that show the fullness of American experience from all the perspectives, especially the people who very much suffered and died and, you know, built everything here. Yeah, like they need to know these things, and as Lisa mentioned, they're smart. Like you know, they're not going to go through the world thinking like, oh yeah, no, everything is you know great. You know, they're going to notice these things. They're going to notice these changes, these perspectives, and the obstacles that come with you know addressing these things with their friends. You know, the parents of their friends, the people they're coming up against on the street, and it doesn't matter where you live, you're not safe from it forever. You know, you can't be sheltered from it forever. So let them have the books. You know, let them explore the world in a space that's honestly much safer than where they might first get it on the street.
I think the other part of that too is just like pushing back against like the nostalgia that sometimes people have of like earlier times and them being better. You know, I responded to somebody's comment the other day online where they said they were complaining about how they felt, you know, today there's so much talk about race and, you know, back in the 80s, like their comment was back in the 80s, like, you know, we should talk about race and everybody got along. And I wrote, that's not the way I remember the 80s. And I think, I find that, you know, with young people, like, sometimes you have to point things out to them too, because they'll think that something that they read from like historical fiction, like that's things like don't happen like that anymore. And so, for example, I teach Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which takes place in 1933 in Mississippi, and so lynchings and all of those things are going on. And then I had to like connect that to the present, because I found that when I wasn't doing a good job of that, students thought that that was the past, and like things like that didn't happen anymore. You know, and of course, we had this year that the Anti-Lynching Act was finally passed in 2022, over, you know, I think 100 years after it was first introduced in Congress. And so I talk to my students like, so that's the past, this is the present. You see how those two things are connected. So I think that's a big job of us too as writers, to help people not gloss over history and to remember it the way it actually was and how it connects to us today.
Picking up on the link between history and the present moment, and tying that in with the power of stories. Quintin, in your book, in your second collection of poems, Caretakers for Stolen People, I was struck by the way you compare the stories of a culture and real life through comic book characters that you reference. Why was it important for you to put Barack Obama in conversation with 3 Black superheroes?
So the interesting thing about this book was like I never really expected that this book would be like my reckoning with like the fact that Obama was president. I didn't really. So the first time I like had the opportunity to vote for him, I had just turned 18. You know, so like at that time I was like, yeah, like you know, I vote Democrat because Democrats, you know, have been you know the best thing for my people as far as I understand, and it's Barack Obama. I like what he says. You know, I'm from the Chicago area, so like it wasn't just like he was just some politician. Like a lot of local touch points with who he was as a person and what he stood for, and his family as well, right? So now I'm just like, okay, what did that mean? You know, because one, like he did a lot of questionable things as well, but at the same time, like it was still momentous in terms of this idea again of like there are a lot of kids now, you know, who were kids then and who were closer to adults. They got to imagine a world that they never thought they could imagine, that they could be president of this country. We talk about it a lot, but a lot comes with that. So in the particular poems, it's in the instance of Marvel Comics, everyone knows Captain America, but more recently in the comics, and a lot of people know from the TV show, Sam Wilson, who was originally Falcon, becomes Captain America. He takes over the mantle. The TV show kind of gets into it a little less than the comic does. That's based on the idea that like what it means to be black and assume like the mantle of Captain America in various ways. But he's not the first and he's not the last. And so I was like, okay, like let's write a series of poems about these black men who then have to be a symbol for an America that does not treat them with the amount of credence they should get for the fact that they are, you know, running things, you know, and not only running things, they are wearing the symbols of this country as they do it. So I think the importance of that and the nature of, you know, bridging those two things was this idea of like, let's bring in some fantasy to talk to some reality. You know, Barack Obama had to do it, and it clearly wore him down, you know, as much as he's living his best life now, which I mean, I love to see, but you know, it's a complicated legacy that he had to inherit, because I think even despite his best intentions, you know, like anyone, I would think most people know, like you're just not president, you don't get to do what you want, you know, and so how he reconciled that in that legacy of like, you know, what job he was taking on, you know, this is essentially what happens when, you know, in one case you're Sam Wilson, and you know Captain America, who's been this, you know, blue-eyed, blonde-haired guy for years, says, "All right, the job is yours now. I'm sitting back." And then Isaiah Bradley, you know, being not only a completely erased Captain America, but tortured for it. You know, tortured to the point of having those abilities. And then we have Josiah X, who not only was confined so that he could be experimented on for years to continue to have those abilities and be a weapon for the U.S. government, but having to contend with the fact that he is following on the legacy of Isaiah, who he was cloned from, right? Like, that all these people have these things, but the things they have come from this trauma, and how do they forge their own path, and how do they make themselves within the America that is the costume that they have to wear? And you know, Barack had to do the same thing, and we do as well. You know, this idea of not only what it means to be Black American, but what does it mean to be Black in America, is something that we all have to kind of reflect on. And so for me, the characters and the person were a good way to kind of think about that. You know, like, how do I want America to be a better country for myself and, you know, my family, but also like how can I also at the same time talk about that legacy, you know, what it does to me as I try to do that. So yeah, it at the same time it was a fun poem. I got to write about comics. You know, and I was just like, yeah, thank you Disney Plus, because you were going to get me some more traffic on this poem. Please put out the series. Dual purposes, but yeah, at the onset it was a fun thing to do, you know. And I only very recently started reading comics, so I was like, you know, like let's have some fun with it.
Definitely. I'm a big comic book nerd myself, so I appreciated that too. In both of your works, you celebrate and uplift Black people, along with the stories that you're telling about and for us. I wanted to ask, why was it important for you to portray authors who have their hair is in locks and cornrows on the cover of your page? Like, why was this important for you?
I think it's just that, you know, I talk about, like, my author's note that, like, this is a book that, like, me as a child would have loved to have found, and, you know, growing up in, you know, the 80s and all, I love fantasy, but I didn't see a lot of books that had, you know, characters that looked like me, and so, you know, I read the classics, you know, Brookline Booksmith, the Narnia Chronicles, and you know, I think there's a lot of writers now who talk about like that, like you can imagine yourself, you know, still and enjoy those stories, but like you still feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect, like, you know, I'm in a story and I'm living through the story through these characters, but like it's not really for me in the same way. And so, you know, the artist who did my cover is Kenyan, and I had a Pinterest board that I collected, and they gave him access that to look up like all these characters, and I just wanted it to be like, you know, to see people who look like the beauty of like our diaspora of people with, you know, different shades of skin, different hair, and different, you know, appearance, but like also just be like something that like kids like me, you know, look and say like, wow, that's like cool. I want to read that because I could see myself in that story.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. That like it's our reality, it's the truth, but we don't often see it depicted. And so,
And why did you choose a comb as to play a central role in the story? Like of all objects, you chose a comb. Why was that?
yeah, there's a lot of like back and forth that I try to do with the lore of like mermaids, like the historical, like, you know, when you think of like the Hans Christian Andersen, Little Mermaid, there's like in my research, like there's all sorts of other like mirrors and combs and you know, wishes, but like these are all things that we think of with mermaids, and so that's part of it. But like I also wanted to like tap into like the non-European version of like, you know, like what else is there in our understanding and history that like revolves around like water spirits and mermaids. And so a lot of the writing that I do like is based on there's Mami Wata, who is a water spirit from Central and West Africa, and there's lots of derivations of her that came through the Caribbean, Trinidad, Haiti, different places, La Serene, there are other people, and so I wanted to weave in both like the Black diasporas, like the way that we have like envisioned water spirits and mermaids and that power and like the power of the ocean. We've talked about like the Atlantic, but then also like tap into the parts that are familiar to people. So like, oh, you know, I know that these things, you know, are part of the myth of, you know, mermaids. And so the comb though, I also connect to, even though it's like part of like the tradition of mermaids, back again to this whole history of like enslavement, because, you know, where this comb come from, we eventually find out it's carved by a freeman who made it and gave it to his daughter, and she's the one who gives it to the mermaid. So like there's that connection to both the past and then also this kind of fantastical world.
Quintin, in your books as well, there like I've been asking Lisa about hair and locks and cornrows and of her characters. In your works as well, you also speak to the primacy of black hair. In the poem, the Afro speaks of beauty and the barber chair. Why was this so important for you to talk about?
So it's this idea of like community centers, right? Like where are our unofficial community centers? Sitting on a stoop because your sister is getting her hair braided by your cousin. Barbershop, where everyone's in the barbershop conversing about things or watching a movie and, you know, no one's getting a haircut or conversations are happening. And so, you know, it's like this idea, like what does hair do beyond, you know, sit on us? Like how does hair bring us together? But also, you know, this idea about talking back against, you know, things that really set certain expectations around, you know, standards of beauty, you know, which is so I've had my hair like this for just about a year now, right? And I would have never ever thought years ago that I would have ever locked my hair. Would have never even begun to imagine. I've grown my hair out several times throughout the years, and I remember someone asked me, like, oh, would you ever consider locking it? I was like, not my thing, right? But like starting to ask myself, like, you know, like why? You know, is it just I don't think it's something that would look nice on me, or because like of other reasons? And so it's interesting, like looking on the forums and whatnot for people with, you know, locks. It's just like someone was just like, yeah, I'm learning to really love my new growth now, and someone was like, hey, I think that's really awesome that you read this in a lighthearted way, but also like I think it's interesting in a serious sense of like how we fight back against expectations about how our hair needs to look, but because where those expectations are based, right? Now it's like, this is great, this is glorious, like, right? Like, this is the stuff we should be celebrating. The fact that these are things that are ours, right? This is ours. This is something that no one else can take from us or replicate in the way we do it. So like, yeah, like, why not celebrate it in some poems, right? Let's talk about all of that. So yeah, I think it's interesting and good.
Definitely. And as you speak to the barbershop as community centers and this front street where your sister's getting her hair done by her cousin, can you speak to the importance of community, family, and home in the African diaspora?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, ultimately it's all kind of centered around, you know, when you take a large group of people away from their families, right? When you break up families before and after they cross, and then people have to find and forge new families and contend with years and years of not knowing where they're from, not being able to trace their lineage to specific places. I think you naturally try to build toward that and around that. And you know, like, not only what family, you know, means in terms of the sense of your blood related to, but like, you know, like what family means in that community sense. Like, who are the people in your neighborhood who have known you since you've grown up? You know, who in the midst of an emergency that your parents need to get to, they would say like, hey, can you watch, you know, my kids because something happened? And that trust that's there, right? Like, how does that trust get formed, and why does it get formed? You know, like, you're talking to a lot of people who had to very much establish a found family in certain ways, and then what we had to do to keep that, right? Like, I think, you know, another recent, like, you know, historical event that people know about, now know about in Black history is, you know, Tulsa, right? Tulsa is a very recent, like, you know, thing for people to learn about, and like, you know, so we see what happens when we build a community. And how that community is, you know, they try to forcibly strip it away from us when we have that. So of course we like tend to try and hold tight to it because like we know everything that's going to fight against even the smallest pocket of us coming together. And what happens when it reaches a certain scale. So we have to celebrate. We have to write about it. We have to talk about it because, you know, like there are places out there where, I mean, even then if you think about the idea of Black fatherhood, right? Especially in today, right? I wrote a lot of poems in that second book about it because we are denied the idea that Black fatherhood exists. And so, what can we do for that? You know, what can we do to talk about the fact that, yes, like, Black families are not just, you know, mom, dad, and, you know, a couple of kids. Black families are these amazing things that are multifaceted in terms of the people who are within them and where they come from and what that means, but also like, yeah, like, we have some of that too, and we should celebrate that when we have that and everything else.
Absolutely, and I think when you talk about like the community, I mean, it's definitely something that I grew up with. You know, my dad's family settled here in Boston, and Boston has a huge Caribbean culture, and there's so many people that like through the church when I grew up, you know, sister this or brother that, and like everybody like, you know, had this close bond if they knew who you were so-and-so's daughter or so-and-so's granddaughter. And on my mom's side, you know, she has a huge family and we used to go to family reunions, we still have family reunions, and, you know, you sort of try to keep track of everybody and it's like, they're just a cousin. Like, if you can't figure it out, they're a cousin somehow, they're related to you. And so I think that's part of like, kind of just like Black life and community that I think is familiar to so many of us, and I think Juneteenth kind of brings that out as well because it's like that celebration and getting together and people that like you know and familiar and being known as part of the community.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with me and for sharing about your work as we celebrate Juneteenth. On the note of family and the celebrations we have together, I want to pause this section of the conversation and open up to our guests for the Q&A portion of the event. If you have any questions, we'll be passing around a microphone if you have questions.
Thank you. Terrific.
Any questions? All right.
Well, this is just a question of information. Just a question of information. I'm curious to know what school you teach at.
Oh, locally. So I'm at the Windsor School, which is right down the street. So I teach 5th and 6th grade.
Okay, thank you.
For sure.
Thank you all so much for being here and speaking to so many of your personal experiences. I've learned a lot, and I was really connected to a lot of what you all have said. As a person of color myself, I've been dealing with a lot of implicit and structural racism, so I'd love to hear how you all, like, we've talked a little bit about self-care, but, like, how do you, like, fight back against that kind of thing when, like Quintin said, like, people are telling you that it's not happening, right? And how you are, like, able to survive and thrive, like, as authors, as poets, and really be able to, like, achieve success despite all of this that everyone's telling you isn't real even.
It's hard. It has like I think for me, like, it's making those choices. I wrote a post about a year or two ago that was called like the power of speaking up, and it really like talked about like how like when I decide to speak up about something that I think is not right, sometimes I have to think about like what's the energy that's going to be expended on my side, like how much am I willing to give to that, and you know, so then sometimes that you know it's like what you have to weigh, because like if I want to fight the battles all the time, you can get burned out, and so I think about like how big is this, you know, how important is this to me? For me, like it might be like in my workplace, like talking about how you know, like tax, like what's the canon? You know, as an English teacher, like that's a big thing, and like you know, I'll bring those discussions up. But yeah, it's sometimes it's like that choice, like how much energy am I willing to spend at this moment on that thing?
I will not argue against racist comments on any kind of online form. That's energy I will never expend. Now, did I once upon a time? Sure. And I learned very quickly that these are people, you're not convincing them. They're there to not to have their minds changed regardless of what the forum is called. And outside of all of that, like, you have people who are just there to troll you anyway, right? So like, why am I wasting my energy trying to teach people things they can easily figure out on their own? So that's like one of like my biggest ways of safeguarding my energy and my space for that is like, I don't, like, the internet is a place I'm not going to be. And when it comes to in person and people I know, if I think you're or know you're a person who has, you know, the right ideas about things in life and how to treat others, I will be willing to tell you that you're pushing a boundary, but you need to figure out on your own what that boundary is. And if I really love you, I will be willing to tell you. Because the thing is, like, I would be spending a very large part of my day telling people why. Thinking about the nature of being a black professional in this country, I'm going to walk into a lot of spaces if I ever change jobs where I'm the only person who looks like me in there, right? So like those kind of conversations would be constant. And to sit and have to try and explain every time, it's energy that I can't spend. And also, like, you know, the thing is, the sad part is like in every moment, especially in the institutional sense when, you know, it comes to like work, like I'm like, I can't be the angry black man today, and I hate it. I hate that I can't be, but I can't be the angry black man today because I'm at my job, you know. But like, I hate that I live in a world where I have to think about that. So, you know, what are those moments and opportunities where I can, you know, be bold? Because, you know, sometimes like you just have to. You can't compromise on the language. You can't say like, I have to phrase this in such a way that will not offend their sensibilities while telling them that they have offended my entire existence. You can't do that all the time. Sometimes, I've had like some interesting requests around writing for stuff, and I just tell people, I'm like, look, I appreciate what you think you're doing, but you're tokenizing me in my work for something corporate, right? And the responses I get to that are often like shocked and taken aback, and it's like, but the fact that I'm telling you this means that you're a person I care about enough to tell it. And it's not that you're necessarily trying to do this, but like you are unaware of the fine line between uplifting me in my work and using me and my work for an institution of gain. And that's a moment where I'm like, yeah, I can have this conversation, but like at the end of the day, it's a moment to the moment decision where I'm like, I can't spend all day doing this, because like if you really want to know, interesting thing was like I posted on Twitter, not as to respond, but to say like, there's a lot of you here who follow me mutually. Like you follow some people who are very overtly racist. Like I come across these writers, other writers on Twitter, white writers, and they just say like the most ridiculously racist stuff against black people. And I see like all these mutual followers, and I'm just like, and someone was like, well, can you tell us who they are? I'm like, no, like it's not my, like, if I can figure out like that this person like clearly says like, you know, black people are only getting publishing like opportunities because we're black and we're like none of us are talented, like you can see that tweet. You can like, okay, before I hit follow, like I skim. I'm just like, let me just make sure like you're chill before I do this, because like, man, I followed some people where it's like later, it's just like, yeah, like I think like police brutality is just a myth, you know, like everybody who complies is fine. I'm like, you know, if I can do that, if I can take the 5 seconds to do that, you can, and I should not have to use my energy to do that, because, you know, if we want to talk about this idea of personal responsibility, we can have the personal responsibility to make sure we don't associate with people who are racist. I think that's not asking too much. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It takes a lot of mind if I have to tell you how to do it, but, you know, like, let's do that for each other.
I think it's that emotional labor, like what you're willing to give at that moment.
Any other questions? Great, well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.